Chapter 14. An Embarrassing Meeting. Afraid to open her eyes, Nancy stepped from the fireplace and felt for a handkerchief from her pocket. Hannah kept crying, "Bats! Bats! Look out, Nancy! They may bite you!" Nancy could hardly see, but realized that 2 bats were whizzing around the room. Apparently, they were confused by their sudden exit into the lighted room from the dark chimney. Mrs. Gruen, who had flipped the back of her skirt over her head, was rushing to the front door, which she flung open. "Get out! Shoo!" she cried out. By now, Nancy had wiped the soot from her eyes and joined Hannah in trying to force the bats from the house. Finally, the housekeeper ran outside. Nancy followed, and in a minute the flying mammals came too. Nancy and Hannah hurried back inside. "Thank goodness they've gone," Hannah said. "And now, Nancy, you'd better go upstairs for a bath and a shampoo while I clean up that mess in the living room." Nancy needed no urging. She shook off as much soot as possible, then went upstairs. At last, too weary for further treasure hunting, she went to bed. Carol was both alarmed and amused by Nancy's story of the bats the next morning, and for the first time in days a smile came over her pale face. "I can just see you standing there, black from head to foot." Nancy laughed. "I'll confine my hunting to cleaner spots." As the girls helped Mrs. Gruen prepare breakfast, they saw Mr. Hill striding toward the house. "Good morning," the banker hailed them. "All quiet at the tenant house last night. Any excitement here?" "Plenty," Nancy replied, and told him about the chimney episode. He laughed heartily. Soon the 4 were enjoying a hearty breakfast. "I'll have to go to the bank," Mr. Hill said presently. "My chauffeur will call for me, and then I'll send him back to stand guard at the tenant house." "We'll stay here in the inn," Nancy told him. "As soon as my father returns, I'll ask him to station 2 watchmen here, one to relieve your chauffeur. Then Mrs. Gruen and I will go home and take Carol with us." "An excellent plan. The best possible under the circumstances," Mr. Hill declared. "Nancy, you certainly won a major battle of wits against the Jemmets at the tenant house last night." The banker's car arrived shortly, and he rode off. In less than an hour, the chauffeur was back with new tires for Nancy's car. He deftly put them on before taking up guard duty at the old cottage. At noontime, Nancy telephoned her father's office and learned that he had just returned. Swiftly, she outlined the events of the preceding day, and he promised that precautions such as Nancy suggested would be taken. At 1 o'clock, an automobile drove up. In it with Mr. Drew were 2 muscular men. "Private detectives," the lawyer said briefly to Nancy. He posted 1 man at the inn, the other at the tenant house. The guards were to be replaced by another duo at midnight. "Now, Carol, pack your things and we'll take off," Nancy said. "Our worries are over for the time being." While Carol was packing, Mr. Drew told Nancy that the Sidney Boonton families had engaged a lawyer to fight Carol's inheritance from Asa Sidney. "That's a contest where I can't help you, can I?" Nancy asked. "I wish I were old enough to be a lawyer." "You've already done a fine job," her father said, "and I'm sure we'll win the lawsuit. It would help very much, though, if we had some supportable testimony as to why Mr. Sidney favored this orphan girl above his entire family." They stopped speaking as Carol came down the stairway, wearing a shabby coat and carrying an old-fashioned suitcase. She apologized for both. "I never went anywhere and wore uniforms most of the time, so I didn't need any clothes." This gave Nancy an idea. "Carol," she said, "you deserve a good-looking wardrobe. Let's go downtown on a shopping spree. I have charge accounts, and you can pay me back when you receive allowances from your inheritance. We'll buy dresses and shoes and a coat and—" "Oh, I can't believe it!" Carol exclaimed. "This could be the biggest thrill of my life." "It'll be a lot of fun for me, too," Nancy declared, as she locked the front door and gave the key to the watchman. "Let's go now." She took Hannah home first, then set off for the shopping center of River Heights. As Nancy led Carol into the elevator of a big department store, she discovered that the only other occupants were Bess and George. The 2 cousins smiled timidly at the other girls. Then, As if remembering that they were told not to be friendly, they turned aside. Impulsively, Nancy put her hand on Bess's arm. "Bess," she said softly, "I've done nothing. Why must our friendship be broken because of a foolish quarrel that persons now dead had 70 years ago?" To Nancy's surprise, a big tear rolled down Bess's cheek. George bit her lip nervously, glancing from Bess to Nancy. "We can't help it, Nancy," she said finally. "Your father is responsible for keeping our family from its rightful share in Asa Sidney's estate." "Oh, no," Nancy said. "Let's talk this over," she suggested. "In the tea room." Hesitatingly, the cousins agreed, and soon the 4 girls were seated in a quiet corner of the store's restaurant. "Bess, you and George met Carol the same evening I did," Nancy began. "It was the first time we 3 had seen Mr. Sidney." Bess and George nodded, and Nancy continued. "I mentioned that my father was a lawyer, and that night Carol phoned me and said Mr. Sidney wanted to make a new will, and would Dad come to draw it the next morning. Mr. Sidney seemed perfectly competent to me. He didn't appear to you to be unbalanced, did he?" Bess and George looked at each other uncomfortably, then shook their heads. "It's my father's duty to carry out his client's wishes," Nancy went on. "Well, that's my story. Carol's is just as simple. Mr. Sidney chose to make her one of his heirs. It hasn't brought her happiness because of the way your family and the others are treating her." "That's true," Carol said. "The family feud should not interfere with our friendship," Nancy went on. "Why let the anger of great-uncles come between us?" "Nancy," George declared, "you're absolutely right. I'm sorry and ashamed of the way I acted. Please forgive me. I want to be friends." "Oh, Nancy," Bess cried, "I'm so glad we're talking to one another again. And Carol, I'm not going to do anything to break the will." "I'm not either," George added quickly. Nancy laughed in relief, and the others joined in. "What are you girls shopping for?" George asked. "We always have so much fun buying things with Nancy." "Carol wants to get some new clothes," Nancy explained. "Want to help?" "You bet," Bess and George answered. When the store closed that evening, the 4 girls left it chatting merrily and laden with bundles. Carol had been outfitted from head to toe in attractive clothes. Her hair had been trimmed and modishly combed at the beauty salon. She looked very lovely and seemed to have gained self-confidence. But she was not yet entirely at ease. On the way home, she whispered to Nancy, "Please don't go far from me. I'm so afraid the Jemmets may try to harm me. Nancy, do you mind if I don't go back yet to the old mansion to hunt for the hidden treasures?" "Of course not, Carol. I think you'll be happier at my house with Mrs. Gruen. Just take it easy and don't worry." Mr. Drew reached home at 6 o'clock, and soon everyone sat down to dinner. Conversation was general, but as soon as the meal was over, he asked his daughter to follow him into his study. He closed the door and they sat down. "Nancy," he said, "I have a lot to tell you. There's no use upsetting Carol. That's why I wanted to talk to you alone. A theory has been forming in my mind." "About Carol's background?" "Yes." "You suspect Asa Sidney knew who she was?" The lawyer nodded. "I made a trip to the Fernwood orphanage and looked at all the old records. There was not a clue as to who Carol's parents might have been, but I did pick up some other interesting facts." Mr. Drew said that Asa Sidney had been a trustee of the orphanage for many years. He had taken a great fancy to a certain little girl who had been given the name Sadie Wipple, and he insisted it be changed to Carol. The name of the child he had lost was Carol. Then, when the Jemmets, who owned a small restaurant, offered to become foster parents, Mr. Sidney would not give his consent unless the Jemmets agreed to come to his home and work. Frank and Emma did not want to be servants, so the arrangement about the tea room and the promise of a share in Asa's will was worked out. Nancy was intrigued by this information. "Dad, do you think that if Mr. Sidney had lived, he would have told you everything?" "I believe so. Now, unfortunately, we'll have to unearth the secret ourselves, and if we don't, I'm afraid those grasping relatives will take the case to court." "Two of the heirs aren't going to join in," Nancy said with a chuckle, and told about being on friendly terms again with Bess and George. "Well, my congratulations," her father said. "I wish your influence could extend to their parents and great-uncles. By the way, my main reason for going to the Fernwood Orphanage was to tell the directors of the request in Asa Sidney's will that the Jemmets be investigated and probably new foster parents be obtained for Carol." "But now the Jemmets have run away," Nancy reminded her father. "That in itself will be enough to take Carol away from them," the lawyer said. "I'll phone the orphanage and ask permission to keep her here until they decide about new foster parents." "I'm sure the Jemmets will be back," Nancy remarked, "either to get things they've cached away or to hunt for others." "By the way," Mr. Drew said, "I was able to get a court order freezing the contents of those cartons Jemmett stored in the warehouse." As he finished speaking, Nancy stiffened in her chair. She had just seen a menacing face at the partially opened window. End of chapter 14.